Chapter 3. An Archaeological Digression. "The figure is totally unfamiliar," said Dr. Imbert. "Nothing even remotely resembling it occurs in Asian or African mythology." He scowled and returned the photograph to his youthful visitor, who deposited on the arm of his chair. "I confess," he continued, "that it puzzles and disturbs me. It's preposterously archaeological, if you get what I mean. It isn't the sort of thing that one would imagine." Harris nodded. "I doubt if I could have imagined it from scratch. Without imaginative prompting or guidance from someone who had actually set eyes on it, it would be very difficult to conceive of anything so racial," put in Dr. Imbert. "I believe that is the word you were groping for. That thing is a symbolic embodiment of the massed imaginative heritage of an entire people. It's a composite, like the Homeric epics or the Sphinx of Giza. It's the kind of art manifestation you would expect a primitive people to produce collectively. It's so perversely diabolical and contradictory in conception that one can scarcely conceive of a mere individual anywhere in the world deliberately sitting down and creating it out of his own imagination. I will concede that an unusually gifted artist might be capable of imagining it, but I doubt if such an obscenity would ever form in the human brain without raison d'être, and no individual living in a civilized state would experience the need, the desire to imagine such a thing, and least of all to give it objective expression. Mental illness, of course, might account for it, but the so-called interpretive reveries of psychotics are nearly always of predictable nature. Grotesque and absurd as they may sometimes be, certain images occur in them again and again, and these images are definitely meaningful. They follow prescribed patterns, are crude and distorted representations of familiar objects and people. The morbidities out of which they arise have been studied and classified, and a psychiatrist who knows his business can usually decipher them. If you have ever examined a batch of drawings from a mental institution, you will have noticed how the same motifs occur repeatedly, and how utterly unimaginative such things are from a sane and sophisticated point of view. It is of course true that the folk creations of primitive peoples usually embody or symbolize definite human preoccupations, but more boldly and imaginatively, and occasionally they depart from the predictable to such an extent that even our expert is obliged to throw up his hands. I have always believed that most of the major and minor monstrosities that figure so conspicuously in the pantheons of barbarian races, feathered serpents, animal-headed priests, grimacing sphinxes, etc., are synthetic conceptions. Let us suppose, for instance, that a tribe of reasonably enlightened barbarians is animated by the unique social impulse of cooperative agriculture, and is moved to embody its ideals in some colossal fetish designed to suggest both fertility and brotherhood. In, let us say, a great stone magna mater, with arms outstretched to embrace all classes and conditions of men. Then let us suppose that cooperative agriculture falls into disrepute, and the tribe becomes obsessed by dreams of martial conquest. What happens? To an obligato of tom-toms and war drums, the mother goddess is transfigured. A spear is placed between her extended arms, the expression of her face altered from benignity to ferocity, great gashes chiseled in her cheeks, red paint smeared on her arms, breasts and shoulders and her ears lopped off. Let another generation pass, and the demonic goddess of war will be transformed into something else, perhaps into a symbol of the most abandoned kind of debauchery. In 100 years, the original fetish will have become a monstrous caricature, a record in stone of the thoughts and emotions of generations of men. It is the business of the ethnologist and the archaeologist to decipher such records, and if our scientist is sufficiently learned and diligent, he can, as you know, supply a reason for every peculiarity of configuration. Competent scholars have traced, in a rough way, the advance or retrogression of racial groups in ethical and aesthetic direction merely by studying and comparing their objects of worship, and there does not exist a more fruitful science than idolography. But occasionally our ethnologist encounters a nut that he cannot crack, a god or goddess so diabolical or grotesque or loathsome in conformation that it is impossible to link it associatively with even the most revolting of tribal retrogressions. It is a notorious fact that human races are less apt to advance than circle back on the course of evolution, and that idols and fetishes that were originally conceived in a comparatively noble spirit very often become, in the course of time, embodiments of the bestial and the obscene. Some of the degraded objects of worship now employed by African Bushmen and Australian Aborigines may conceivably have been considerably less revolting 10 or 15,000 years ago. It is impossible to predict the depths to which a race may descend, and the appalling transformation which may occur in its sacred imagery. And so occasionally we encounter shapes that we scarcely like to speculate about, shapes so complicatedly vile that they haven't even analogous counterparts in comparative mythology. Your fetish is of that nature. It is, as I say, preposterously archaeological, and it differs unmistakably, although I am willing to concede a superficial resemblance, from the distorted dream images conjured up by psychotics and surrealistic artists. Only racial dissolution and decay, extending over wide wastes of years, could, in my opinion, account for such a ghastly anomaly. He leaned forward and tapped Algernon significantly upon the knee. "You haven't told me its history," he admonished. "Reticence is an archaeologist's prerogative, and in our work it is always an asset, but for a young man you're almost abnormally addicted to it." Algernon blushed to the roots of his hair. "I'm seldom actually reticent," he said. "At the museum they all think I talk too much. I've an exuberant, officious way at times that positively appalls Mr. Scollard. But this affair is so outside all normal experience that I've been dreading to tax your credulity with the resume of it." Dr. Imbert smiled. "Your books reveal that you are a very cautious and honest scholar," he said. "I don't believe I'd be inclined to question the veracity of whatever you may choose to tell me." "Very well," said Algernon, "but I must entreat that you suspend judgment until you've heard all of the evidence. One can adduce rational explanations for each of the incidents I shall describe, but when one views them in the sequence in which they occurred, they resolve themselves into a devastating, hideous enigma." Very tersely, without self-consciousness or affectation, Algernon then related all that he knew and all that he surmised and suspected about the thing whose image spread defilement on the paper before him. Dr. Imbert heard him out in silence, but his eyes, as he listened, grew bright with horror. "I doubt if I can help you," he said when Algernon was done. "This thing transcends all of my experience." There ensued a silence. Then Algernon said in a tone of desperate urgency, "But what are we to do? Surely you've something to suggest." Dr. Imbert rose shakingly to his feet. "I have, yes. I know someone who can, perhaps, help. He's a recluse, a psychic, a magnificent intellect, obsessed by mysteries and mysticisms. I put little faith in such things. To me, it's a degradation. But I'll take you to him. I'll take you, anyway. God knows you're in trouble. That is obvious to me. And this man may be able to suggest something. Roger Little is his name. No doubt you've heard of him. He used to be a criminal investigator, a good one, a psychologist, discerning, erudite, shrewd, no mere detective novel sleuth." Algernon nodded understandingly. "Let us go to him at once," he said.